is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In a new book, Children Under Fire, An American Crisis, Washington Post reporter John Woodrow Cox looks at the massive toll gun violence is taking on the nation's young people. He builds a case that millions of children are paying a psychic price, even if they don't show up in traditional statistics on things like gun deaths and school shootings. He joins us now. John, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thanks so much for having me back.
We have a lot of ground to cover here, but I want to start with what's in your book, and then later on in the conversation, I want to talk about how you did it. The book focuses on two children. There's Tyshawn and Ava, who are witnesses to the trauma of gun violence in different ways. Tell us a little bit about them.
Sure. So, I was drawn to them because they were not physically wounded, which your intro gets right into. And I had a lot of choices, unfortunately, of children who I could follow for the book. And Ava is a little girl from South Carolina, a very rural, conservative area of South Carolina. She was on her playground. This was back in 2016. She was a first grader when this teenager, 14-year-old, pulls up in a truck, gets out and fires on this class of first graders. The entire shooting only lasted 12 seconds before the teenager's gun jammed. But Ava's best friend, a little boy named Jacob Hall, he was shot to death. He was the only person who died. And that's really why most people have not heard of that school shooting in Townville Elementary, because the way we often look at school shootings are the ones that we're going to devote time to or thought to or media to is dependent entirely on how many people died. Ava was devastated by that day, both by the trauma of hearing the gunshots and especially of losing Jacob. She dealt with enormous amounts of guilt, and she's been diagnosed with PTSD and suffers really debilitating symptoms from this. A lot of anger and depression, and it's really extreme in her case. And the other child in the book, the other primary child, is Tyshawn McFadder. He is a little boy who's grown up in Southeast D.C., and he had several experiences with gun violence early in his life. He'd been on a slide one day when a shooting started. He'd been at home when somebody started shooting outside, and he had to dive behind the bed. And another time, somebody shot a bullet hole through the front door. And all of that led up to his father's death. He was shot in the middle of the day in March of 2017, and Tyshawn was just less than a block away, actually, in his school when that happened. And what makes it really remarkable is after, I wrote about these kids for the Post, or sort of during the course of that reporting, Ava wrote Tyshawn a letter, and it basically said, would you like to be my pen pal? And it started this remarkable friendship in which these kids have become each other's supports. They've really become dear friends, and it's all based on the fact that they have this horrible thing in common, that they've lost someone to gun violence.
I don't want to give away too much of some of the specialness of this book, because there's a lot in here, John, that's very special. But there is something about that introductory moment when you bring Tyshawn that letter from Ava. And what's really interesting about that is you were carrying another letter with you too, weren't you?
Right, I was. It's from Supreme Court Justice Sotomayor. And I tried my best to explain to Tyshawn what a big deal that was, that, this is one of the most important people in the world who cares about him, had read his story, and wanted him to know that she was thinking about him. And Tyshawn could not have really cared any less. And it's no disrespect at all to the Supreme Court Justice, but it was the fact that this little girl cared about him and wanted to be his friend. And that was so overwhelming for him. He was so excited, actually, that he ran upstairs and sketched out this letter back to her, and it had all these misspellings. It was, almost incomprehensible. You just couldn't read it because he'd written so fast. So his mom said, okay, you were too excited. You need to take your time and write another letter.
What I think is interesting in both of these young people that you chose is that their school lives and school resources, or sometimes lack thereof, are part of the story and part of their healing process. And I thought that was important, that you can't separate the student from their larger world experiences.
Yeah, that is so true. Much of the book is devoted to what happens before kids get shot and how do we deal with that then. But a great deal is also about, well, we know this is going to keep happening. How do we address that? What do we do about it? And by sort of raising those issues through the experiences of these two kids, they have both struggled and continue to struggle getting the proper mental health care that they deserve and that they need. But, in Tyshawn's case, his mother really couldn't afford it. She was not on Medicare, so she couldn't get the free therapy that was offered through the school. But she didn't make enough money to go out and get him private support. And because he was not legally considered the victim of anything, there was really nothing there for him. And he represents, millions of kids who've gone through something like that in this country, especially in Black and brown communities. And then in Ava's case, her parents went through a half a dozen therapists. They were similarly strapped. They just couldn't really afford to go get the care that she needed. And this is so often the case when these type of events happen.
One of the things that you talk about in your book in a fair amount of detail is how much we don't know about what kids need or how much kids are being impacted. And part of that is because it's not being studied. What is keeping or has kept previously the CDC from ordering these kinds of federal evaluations of the impact of gun violence?
So in the mid-1990s, an Arkansas lawmaker by the name of Jay Dickey introduced a single sentence into a spending bill that basically said, the CDC can't use government resources, taxpayer money, for gun control. That's more or less what he said. And it had such a chilling effect that the CDC just stopped studying gun violence entirely for over 2 decades. It would be as if in the middle of the pandemic, we had decided, we don't like the politics around this, so we're not going to study COVID. That's what it would be. This was in the middle of a gun violence crisis in the United States, the mid-90s, when the crack epidemic was fueling enormous amounts of gun violence. And they just stopped studying it. And not until just the last few years has Congress begun to devote even nominal amounts of money. The money they've spent so far is really mostly symbolic, but at least it's starting again, because that has set us back. That decision has set us back 2+ decades. We would be so much farther along if we had just studied the crisis, but we just didn't.
While the research might have been quashed, the industry that's sprung up around school shootings and trying to prevent them, and I would say capitalizing on the fears of parents and educators and policymakers, it's incredible. How much money are we talking about?
This is a $3 billion industry, and that excludes the huge amount of money that schools spend for private security or school resource officers. So we're talking, maybe double that number, maybe 5 or 6 billion if you accounted for that as well. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it is an industry that only exists because of fear. It only exists because we have allowed children to be routinely shot to death in their schools. Without those things, this industry would not exist. And, I went to Orlando, that's a chapter in the book, to go to one of these conferences. And there is this sort of giddiness. This was pretty soon after Parkland, and there was this sort of excitement, until you point out like the reality of why they're there, and then suddenly they sort of, I'm not just a salesperson. I maybe I should, have some empathy for what these school kids are going through. And there's so many of these ideas are based in no reality at all. Bulletproof backpacks and these doors that, they would propose would go in front of every single school classroom, and that they allege could, identify where the gunman is and the caliber of the weapon and signal to police. And, the fact that we've decided that this is how we're going to address this crisis in this country with these sort of, absurd, gimmicky, whiteboards that prevent rounds from AK-47s being shot through them. We've decided to address it that way than addressing the actual cause. But so much of that is because of the pressure put on schools to say, you fix this. You fix this societal problem. It's on you. So I understand the pressure that the superintendents and the principals feel because the parents are so desperate for something to be done because, it's not happening on Capitol Hill. So then it's up to the schools, which is such an unreasonable expectation.
So what you just talked about putting it on the schools to buy the devices, to put in the infrastructure, to make schools into fortresses. But then there's also, of course, putting the pressure on children somehow to protect themselves, putting the onus on them. And that, of course, I want to turn now. What is ALICE?
So Alice is a company that has become really popular, and what they do is they offer training. Alice is an acronym, the ALICE, for sort of all these different tactics that if there's a school shooter, this is what you do. A lot of it is pretty standard, sort of traditional, old kind of guidance on what you do in an active shooter situation, where you hide and then you run, and things that are pretty common. The one that is by far the most controversial is the C, and that stands for counter. And basically, what they have suggested is that children attack the gunman. That's what the guidance offers. I went to Alice, of course, and they said, well, we leave this up to the schools. Well, Alice is training these schools, offering this as an option. There is zero evidence that children attacking an armed attacker saves anyone's lives. And in fact, I've studied almost every single school shooting since Columbine, and there are lots of examples of children confronting shooters and then being shot. But there are no, I asked Alice, well, give me examples of this counter strategy saving somebody's life, of actually working, and they couldn't do that. And their response was, well, shooters tend to be similar in age to the people that they shoot, and a group of 14-year-olds could easily take down another 14-year-old with a gun. I mean, based on what? They couldn't answer that question. There was no evidence or proof to say that that was reality, but that's their position, and Alice has become immensely popular among school districts in the United States.
So Alice is alert, lockdown, inform, counter, evacuate. So we talked a little bit about counter. I really want to talk about lockdown. You did a massive project with Washington Post data journalist Stephen Rich, and you found that a staggering number of children have been subjected to lockdowns, often at an emotional cost. Give us a quick synopsis of that project.
Sure. And I adapted that in the book and expanded on it. And what we found was that more than 4 million students in one school year had gone through an actual lockdown. Not a lockdown drill, but an actual lockdown. The vast majority of those were caused by gun violence, or certainly the majority were caused by gun violence. And whether that was maybe the threat of a shooting at the school, a bank robbery down the street in which a gun was used, or just random gunfire in the neighborhood. We define America, defines lockdown very broadly. That can mean all sorts of things. The traditional lockdown is you lock all the doors, you shut the lights off, and the kids hide under the desk. And what we know, really in my view, the biggest impact in many ways, beyond the deaths of kids who die in schools, the biggest impact of this phenomena of school shootings in America is this. It's children who are suddenly in a position where they hide in the corner of their classroom, and a meaningful percentage of them think that they are going to die. They think they're going to get shot. And I know that because they will soil themselves, they will weep, they will write their parents' texts goodbye, they will write wills saying, this is who I want my toys to go to when I die. So, we think of school shootings sort of in this very narrow window of just those kids. We had one just recently, right, where a kid was killed at school. And we think of that child as the face of this issue, when in reality, it's so much bigger than that. The true number of that one school year was probably closer to 8 million, because this data is so poorly kept. We could just confirm more than 4 million, but it's probably about double that. School shootings are rare, lockdowns are not rare. And the trauma from lockdowns is very real.
John, I have to tell you, I was thinking about your reporting when I was going through the news accounts from the insurrection in the Capitol on January 6th, and I couldn't stop thinking about Speaker Nancy Pelosi's staff, who said they had learned how to barricade their hiding spot in her office through their lockdown drills as K-12 students.
Yeah, that's where we're coming to, right? Where the kids who, what we call the Columbine Generation, they're all growing up. And, it's just so sad. It was interesting, too, to see that difference in the insurrection between the people who had grown up with these lockdowns and the ones who hadn't, and sort of the fear they had and the confusion that they felt. Whereas, we're training an entire generation to react to active shooter situations rather than in that very same building passing legislation that might stop those things from happening.
We're talking with Washington Post reporter John Woodrow Cox about his new book, Children Under Fire in American Crisis, Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And many thanks to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and your feedback are helping us to grow. John, we talked about some of what is in your book. I want to talk about how this project came together, and then also what some other reporters, especially education reporters, might learn from your work. The book builds off reporting you did for The Post in 2017, and for which you won the top prize in EWA's National Awards for Education Reporting. How early on in that project did you realize this was going to be a book?
Well, I actually give credit to my agent, David McCormick. The very first story that I wrote, it was about Tyshawn. This was I met Tyshawn in March of 2017, and I think the story published in, I believe it was April. And he sent me an email right away and said, I think there's a book in this. I hadn't really considered it before that, but it became so clear. The more I learned about the impact of gun violence on kids in America, the more I realized that there was just no way I could say everything I needed to say in, a series of newspaper stories. So it very quickly became clear to me that this needed to be a book.
So often when we're writing stories, we're constrained by that space. Even if it's just online, there's only so much your editor is going to let you get away with.
Right.
Books bring a lot of freedom. How did you handle that?
Well, it was a little intimidating, to be honest. I write long stories anyway. I write 5,000 and 6,000 word stories. There is no comparison, though, between 6,000 words and 100,000 words. So it was daunting. I've many times repeated that old cliche. It's cliche, but there's a lot of truth to it, is that, how do you eat an elephant? And it's one bite at a time. And that's very much what the book felt like. I am a obsessive outliner. So I knew what every chapter would be before I wrote anything. I knew how those chapters would begin and end. I knew most of the sections within those chapters really before I set off. So I spent several weeks just going through that arduous process of outlining. I had, note cards and sheets on the wall and all these sorts of things. Once I kind of got a little momentum, it was really freeing. I felt like things that I normally would have to reduce to a sentence or a paragraph, I could make 600 or 700 words in the book. So I really enjoyed that part of it, though. The idea of maybe taking on another book feels intimidating. I don't know how soon I'll jump back into that form.
I'm wondering if anything changed in your process with that freedom, specifically about how you approach interviewing children.
I think that I just got to spend a lot more time. I basically lived in South Carolina for, 3 weeks or a month. I went there a lot, and Tyshawn lives close to where I live, so I spent a great deal of time with him. I just knew suddenly that really I could report as much as I wanted to. And if something compelling happened, I could find a space for it. And I think that was maybe the one thing that changed the most. My approach with kids, I don't think, changed a great deal, because I have kind of a very specific way of dealing with children who've experienced trauma. And I don't think I diverted from that, but I definitely was able to spend just a lot more time with them, talk longer, and just spend more time in their homes and at their schools and churches.
There's a lot of discussion these days among the media, gun violence activists, researchers, experts about how much attention should be given to the perpetrators of these crimes. And you tackled that head on in your book in your decision to name the teenager responsible for the playground shooting in Townsville. That's the one that Ava witnesses. Are the rules different here for book authors than for, let's say, a daily newspaper journalist?
It's an ongoing discussion about how much attention do we give this person. And I think what it should come down to is why. I think that each case we should come at individually, whether it's in a book or in a newspaper or a magazine, and say, if we're going to devote hundreds or thousands of words to this person, why are we doing that? What is the public good? I don't think the idea of glorifying a shooter, which has been done historically, I don't think that serves much of a purpose. And we know that, including the shooter in this book, he was obsessed with other shooters and read everything he could and aspired to be like them or to kill more people than they did. For me, the reason that I devoted a chapter to him is because of the lessons learned. This was a kid who had been expelled from a school. He was very clearly a danger, and he still had access to firearms. despite all that. He was obsessed with torturing animals. He was obsessed with watching videos about torture. He had, brought a machete to school once and threatened to harm other students. That's why he was living at home, is because he couldn't go to school. And yet, his parents didn't recognize that, hey, this is a young man who should not have access to a gun. He ultimately used that gun to kill his father before he drove to the school and opened fire. So that was a lot of it, is to take people into some of these worlds that he was obsessed with, because I think many Americans don't know that there are these whole sort of communities of people who, known as Columbiners, among other terms, who are obsessed with school shooters, and that some of them do in fact turn into real school shooters, as he did. So I thought there was a real public good, which I explain, in the book, in diving into his story and really exposing what it is that led him from point A to point Z.
It's been said many, many times that if Sandy Hook wasn't a tipping point for American society around guns, that nothing was going to be. And then, of course, just a few years later, we had the Parkland shooting. But some things have changed, haven't they? Especially in how I think journalists think about student voices in these discussions.
Yeah, I think so many things have changed. It's often discussed the reaction that we had to Columbine, where for years the commonly held belief was that, well, these two boys were bullied. They were bullied into doing what they did. They were unpopular loners. And that narrative just was not true, but it was commonly held. You don't see that today. We know enough. We've learned enough to know that when a school shooter does something like this, you don't then point to the victims and say, well, what did you do to this sweet white suburban school shooter? I think that's a big part of it. And I think especially, there is this misconception that, well, nothing changed after Sandy Hook. Moms Demand didn't exist before Sandy Hook. Giffords didn't exist before Sandy Hook. These organizations that have invested huge amounts of money and have won lots of elections and have changed innumerable state laws, or have prevented maybe gun rights laws from being passed at the state level, there's been a huge amount of change. And I think, too, the way that we as journalists approach these stories and are much more intent on finding those kids' voices. So I think a lot has changed. What hasn't, of course, happened is that moment on Capitol Hill where a really significant piece of gun legislation is passed. What people forget is that some of that legislation that President Obama fought for after Sandy Hook came very close to being passed. One of those bills got 57 votes. That's the situation we're in again. There's going to be 3 or 4 or 5 Americans who are going to decide for the other 350 plus million what gun laws we have and which ones we don't. It's going to be that small of a number.
It would be great to hear from you a little bit about what might help some education beat reporters get savvier about covering issues related to school safety, especially, bringing a skeptical eye to things like this lockdown training that we've talked about. Are there some smart questions they should be asking, and who should they be asking them of?
So I think they should immediately ask for evidence. Why are you doing what you're doing? And based on what evidence? Because what I know from my research is there's very little evidence to support many of the practices that these schools are taking on. There was a school in Florida that I mentioned in the book that to do a lockdown drill, they sent out a text message saying that there was an active shooter on campus. And the kids freaked out, as of course they would, because they thought there was actually a shooter. And the spokesman defended it later, saying, well, this was the only way to make them take it seriously. That's a horrible idea. Objectively, that's a terrible thing to do to a bunch of kids who've grown up in the Parkland and Sandy Hook era. But we don't ask enough, even in not cases that are not nearly that extreme. We don't ask the schools to say, from where did you get your training? If it was Alice or somebody else, why are you choosing to do it this way? What evidence is there that this works? Make them defend what it is that they're doing. And I think another really important piece in this, it kind of gets in the weeds, but that's, of course, where education reporters love to go, is in the weeds. So they should ask about the levels of lockdown that schools intend to go in. So it is not a best practice if there is a shooting a mile and a half from a school to have all the lights turned off, the doors to be locked, and all the kids to huddle in the corner. That does not make sense. And these are the school districts that have really thought this through. That's what they found, is there needs to be a sort of graduated response to these things, because the lockdown itself will have an effect on some number of those kids. It's incredibly disruptive. So in the book, I focus on this one school that sort of over the course of a number of shootings in Washington, D.C., by the end of it, they realize, these are just neighborhood shootings. They realize, we need to respond in different ways because this is wrecking our children. These kids are dealing with massive amounts of fear because we've put them in this situation. So I think at the reporter level, you just need to be asking those really critical questions. You need to do your own research too to say, what is working in other places. And because it's just such a free-for-all. Every district is just deciding on their own, oh, we're going to buy this, we're going to buy that, or we're going to go by this practice or that practice. There is no sort of national standard practices. And I think that for national reporters, the education reporters, they should be having that discussion with the Department of Education. When are they going to issue some sort of guidance to say to school districts that this is, we've researched it and this is the best way to respond? Because we do know that spending some time in a intelligent way, preparing teachers and to a lesser degree kids for one of these sort of events can actually save lives if they do happen. But right now it's done in such a haphazard way, and I think journalists really need to hold people to account better than they have.
So, John, we made it all the way to the end of this interview without discussing, of course, the big story of the past year or so, and that, of course, is the pandemic. Is there going to be a chapter for the paperback edition on how the pandemic affected children related to gun violence?
There might be. I think that there probably should be. These most recent mass shootings suddenly sort of brought everybody's attention, the Colorado shooting and the Georgia shooting, brought everybody's attention back to gun violence. And I tweeted at the time, said, hey, it's great that everybody's paying attention again, but 2020 was the worst year of gun violence in modern American history. More than 41,000 people died from gun deaths last year. And it's a thing that we have largely overlooked. And certainly kids have been affected as much as anyone because of that. So, I think there very well might be a few more words devoted to that in a paperback.
John Woodrow Cox is an enterprise reporter at the Washington Post, and he is a past recipient of EWA's Hechinger Grand Prize for the best education journalism in the country. John, thank you again for making time for EWA Radio.
Anytime, Emily. Thank you so much for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, just drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.